are your co-hosts this afternoon and bringing you a panel presentation on all things financial for regional school districts. It's called the Unique Financial Challenges and Opportunities of Regional Schools. We have a very distinguished panel here this afternoon, and I would like to introduce them, starting on my left, your right. No, we have it. We don't have it. Oh.
Just look at us.
Mary Jane, let's start this way. I will do it that way. Okay. My information is a little organized in a different way, but Margaret Hughes. Margaret Hughes is chair of the Narragansett School Committee. In a former life, she did finances for the corporate world. She is now a bookkeeper and accountant for a business, and I bring you her. She is going to present today on regional finance and the role of the school committee. Beside her, we have Steve Hemmen. Steve Hemmen is the Assistant Executive Director of MASC. He is also a former superintendent and a former business official. He is presenting today on the assessment process, statutory versus the alternative method. What's the difference? How do you decide which one is best for you? Beside him, we have the very distinguished Jay Sullivan. He is Associate Commissioner for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in the area of school finance and district support center. His presentation is stabilization and regional transportation funds. Beside him is Mary Jane Handy, Director of Accounts in the Division of Local Services, MASC. Today she is presenting on the certification process and E&D for information. And last but certainly not least, we have Erin Oka, the School Business Administrator for the Cape Cod Regional Technical High School. Her presentation today is, what is OPEB? On your tables you have copies of this sheet. This is the contact information if you choose to reach out to these people. They each have a presentation. It's all combined into one streaming PowerPoint. The information will be posted on our website, NASBO's website, MAS's website, so it will be available to you following this workshop today. Each presenter is going to present for a few minutes and then allow for questions. And so you may offer your questions then, and perhaps there'll even be some time at the conclusion of our full presentation if you have more questions. Shall we begin?
So I was told I had 8 minutes, so if I go long, just give me the universal cut sign, because Lord knows I can talk. We can skip right through and jump right in. So the role of the school committee when it comes to regional finance, the first is to understand that we are our own municipality, unlike single town or city district schools. So understanding that, number one. But we have policies, agreements, laws, statutes, all of these things we need to consider that we need to abide by and be familiar with as school committee members and understand what trumps what. So we start with our policies. Flip the slide, thank you. Section D in our policy book is fiscal management, and that's one that every school committee member should familiarize themselves with. MASC has a wonderful reference guide that also points out the various changes that regional school districts should look at when they put their policies together. So it's important that you do take a look at Section D. Your other sections are, of course, just as important, and some do dovetail on your financial management, but this is the key to your financial management section. The second piece that you need to then understand is your regional agreement. It's going to outline things like your assessment methodology, capital debt and debt assessment methodology, your budget process, one person, one vote, a whole bunch of things, and you have to be familiar with how your agreement is set up so that you can understand how you need to look at your budget and what challenges you're going to face, which I'll talk about in a little bit, when it comes to getting your budget approved. The next piece, and I will not read all of these here, I just put them for reference, laws and statutes. As you can see, we have a whole section of Mass General Law, Chapter 71, Section 16, that talks about regional school district status, powers, and duties. If you haven't had a chance or need some good bedtime reading, grab the law book. MASC has this wonderful, nice door holder, I think people have called them at times, but familiarize yourself with this section because I find that I do go back to it often because you can't remember everything. It's a great reference tool to understand what the responsibilities are as a regional school district. And then there's regulations. We have one, 603 CMR 41, which is DESI's regulations on regional districts that you need to understand. So that's the areas of information that you need to familiarize yourself with as a school committee member. So that's all good and well, but now how do you put that into practice? Because we all know that once we get to our school committee meeting, subcommittees and other duties, the real world takes over and we have to figure out how to implement all of this great knowledge that we now have. So we have a warrant subcommittee, and we have policy DK called payment procedures, which says, and I'm going to read it because this is very important, is that as an operating procedure, the committee will receive monthly lists of bills, which is your warrants, for payment from school department funds. The list is certified as correct and approved for payment by the school committee or subcommittee. Actual invoices, statements, and vouchers will be available for inspection by the school committee. This is what my district's policy DK says. This is what's in the reference manual for MASC. If this is not part of your school committee procedures, school committee policies, you may want to look at this one and figure out how to get this up for review and possible implementation with this wording. It's really important that as a school committee, we take a look at all of the backup for every dollar spent in the district. And everyone needs to recognize that as school committee members, we have the right to ask for all of the backup that needs to be provided to us because we're responsible at the end of the day for every dollar spent. Subcommittee, for the warrant subcommittee, this comes up, I've already heard it twice today. It must follow open meeting law guidelines. If you read through your law book, it says that the whole school committee can put a subcommittee in place for the warrant process of 3 members, a minimum of 3 members. And that is an official subcommittee of the school committee, which means they have to follow open meeting law guidelines. Meetings must be posted, there must be minutes, they actually have to happen. So there's been a lot of questions when the Municipal Modernization Act in 2017 went in. This did not change the guidelines for school committees. It only referenced cities and towns.
Okay, so I have a subcommittee of 3. Is it legit if 2 voted?
Yes.
Yes, it's a majority there, yes. And then remember too that you would need to then bring that list of warrants and everything to the full committee to vote on it as a full committee to approve, because at the end of the day, every one of the committee members is responsible for all of the dollars spent. So it should be presented to the full committee to approve the bills and payroll as presented that the warrant subcommittee has signed off on.
I was told I could bring a report to the committee and they could accept the report of the subcommittee who voted the warrants.
What I will tell you, and I think this may be terminology, is in my district what we do to meet the requirement is it is a report. Here was the warrants, here's the dollars. The information's always available if someone in the full committee wants to see it.
Yes.
So I think it's semantics is report versus, so, and I'm not an expert on this, so run it past your legal counsel.
I was going to speak up because I'm superintendent of the district that Dawn's in, and our legal counsel did say, bring it forward, but be careful not to phrase the vote exactly the same way because you don't want the vote of the school committee. You don't want 2 votes on the same warrant, so our legal counsel advised us that warrant subcommittee votes to release the checks, school committee votes to accept the report of the warrant subcommittee.
As presented, yeah.
As presented.
Okay, so thank you.
Is it required to have a separate subcommittee, or can it fall under business and finance subcommittee?
You don't have to call it a warrant. You can delegate the responsibility to a subcommittee. It doesn't have to be called the warrant subcommittee. You can call a subcommittee anything you want, and you define what the responsibilities would be.
What are the legal ramifications from a school committee member if you have a warrant subcommittee that goes in, they sign the warrants, meeting minutes are then presented to the full school committee for approval. We then approve it, but no member of that subcommittee bothered to read the backup, and the backup is not sufficient. What are the ramifications and responsibilities as a full member?
Change your subcommittee.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass on answering that. If you could hold that question, and maybe we could circle back at the end, because I think that might be more involved and well out of my wheelhouse of knowledge to answer, but there may be people who can give you some thoughts and guidelines on an answer to your question. In the interest of my 8 minutes. Many school committees delegate the development of the budget to a subcommittee. Some prefer to do it as work of the committee as a whole. I will give you some firsthand experience on subcommittee. My district has always done it in subcommittee. This year we moved to a committee of the whole because we found that too many members outside of the subcommittee had some really good questions and insight that the 3 members on the subcommittee didn't think of or just didn't think to ask, and it was unfair to show up at a budget hearing and have to take so much time to either, I hate to bring them up to speed, but delve into some of the detail that should have been worked out in the budget committee. So this will be our first year as a committee of the whole holding our finance meetings. I know there's been a lot of chatter on some of the different listservs about what's the best way to do it. I don't know if there's a best way, but it's whatever works for your district. I'll report back maybe next year how this year worked for us. It seems to be going well so far. The key piece, though, is that you need to determine how you want your budget created. And there's a lot of lingo that's thrown out there. I did corporate finance for a lot of years. I did specialty budgeting, so it's kind of, I understand it. But a lot of people don't. So you have to decide how you want to approach your budget. And share that and have the discussions up front with your superintendent and your business manager, because you're going to make them insane when you start asking for 1,000 iterations and 52 different versions. Did I do that to you?
No.
No, okay. Level funding, okay, do you want to create a budget that level funds, meaning keeping expenses flat with no growth? Do you want to have level service? We want to provide the same services next year that we have this year, which may mean you need to do some normalizations by taking out one-time expenses and annualizations for things that didn't have a full year of expense this current year, so you can come to that level service baseline. Do you want to do zero-based budget? I'm going to tell you from my many years in budgeting, it's all a fallacy. Nobody zero-based budgets. Unless you have a brand new organization, it doesn't happen. So if anyone tells you they zero-based budget, nod and smile and say that's great, so how do you really do it? And it's usually level service or level fund. So, or you might want to choose a hybrid. Again, it's going to be whatever works best for your district and how your school committee will be able to understand the information. There is so much detail, we can't all be experts in every dollar, but we need to have enough information presented so that we can understand what we're talking about, because, you know, as a school committee, this is what we're advocating for, the funding to help our students succeed. So the next bit would be monitoring that budget. So we've got a budget. How do we jumped to the wrong slide. The annual budget process. So the budget is a policy document to support your district's goals. And I think that's one thing that we, as a school committee, at least I fail to keep reminding myself as we develop this budget, is it really does set the policy on our goals. If we value something enough to say that it's a goal, we should be funding that. Or we should have a really good reason why we can't fund it. So when you set your goals, you want to be sure that your budget supports that as a part of the policy document. MGL 7116B sets forth guidelines for the regional budget process. It includes all of these things. There's a 2/3 vote required by the school committee. To pass your budget, you've got to get it certified, send those certified numbers to the town. 2/3 of member towns must approve the budget for it to be adopted, and that's with the statutory Because if you have an alternate assessment, I think everyone has to approve it, so it's a statutory method, and Steve will talk to that. The school committee is responsible for approving the budget. We hold budget hearing. Hopefully, maybe 2 of them is usually good. It's good to have a preliminary one to find out what the issues are, so that when you go to your final one, you can potentially go vote. And then certifying that budget for the city and towns to adopt. And we as school committee members need to act as advocates for the budget. One of the disconnects that we've seen time and again is that we fail to advocate back to our own towns. We should be side by side with our superintendent and business manager at finance committee meetings, at the select board meetings, at the town meetings that normally you're at anyway to vote. But we should be there, support and advocate for the numbers. If there's any type of issue that comes up, you know, I dare you say the override word. You know, we need to advocate, and we need to have our story straight of why we need the funds and what they're for, and we need to stand side by side with the entire committee as well as within each town to make sure that the messaging gets across. So it's important that we are advocates. How do we monitor the budget? So we've got these numbers, we need some budget reports. We monitor budget reports monthly from the business manager. Some districts might do it twice every other month or even quarterly. I like to look at the numbers monthly. The report should include not just your general fund, but your revolving funds and your grants. It's really important to understand where you are holistically as a district from your financials, because grants and revolving funds are just as important as that general budget. You need to pay attention to your encumbered funds. Don't let them sit as encumbered if you're drawing down against them, because then you could show a negative position when you don't have that. And important line item transfers need to be approved by the school committee. And then just a couple other things to consider or know. And I love this little blurb here, that by law, although, and this is the regional school committee, functions as a duly elected committee of town government, the school committee has, unlike other town boards, autonomous and absolute authority within limitations established by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to carry out the education policies of the state and guide the education process. And that, I think, needs to be the core of every school committee's charge. We do come from different towns, but our charge is to make sure that every student in our district succeeds. And then just a couple other things. Where does the money come from? General fund, revolving account, a grant, regional transportation and the impact, which we'll get to. And you should probably know what hold harmless means if you don't.
Thank you. So we've had some questions, so we're going to move into our next presentation so we can keep our questions to the end. Judy? Thank you.
Steve.
Me? Well, good afternoon. It's really nice to see everybody here at regional schools and understanding how they operate. By the way, Margaret mentioned about budgets. I did an interim year in 15-16, and she was vice chair, so she was pretty good. Didn't ask too many options on budget, so I have to give her credit for that. What I'm talking about is the assessment method. There's the foundation, there is the statutory method and an alternate assessment. And occasionally people get a little confused in following this, so we thought today we would do a little bit on that. So, school finance vocabulary to start with is that you have to deal with the foundation budget, minimal local contribution, target share, Chapter 70, and the net school spending. Foundation budget, I think people should know what that is. It's basically that the state determines the minimum dollars required to educate students, does not include transportation, debt, or capital. You have to keep that in mind as we go through this. And you can see the rest of it. It's based the enrollment changes, and it's every year there's an inflation factor and so forth in building the foundation budget. The enrollment is based on what's the financial responsibility of a district, meaning the students still in the district, school choice out, charter, and any child that's in a residential special ed placement. Those are you're responsible, so that's part of your foundation budget. So this is what you take a look at, your foundation budget, just so you can see what it looks like. Especially this year, if you take a look, they're talking about ELL, the orange and orange is brand new this year, is part of that. The foundation budget commission took into account on what the more expensive to have as special ed students and certain things at ELL and so forth. So that's accounting for, so the foundation budget would increase. So one of the things that when you're doing this, you have to, once you know, and when the governor sends out his budget, the DESE will put this stuff up on the website, and you first thing you want to fill out your foundation budget, so you know what that is. The Department of Revenue then will calculate the amount of dollars each community must contribute to the required minimum local contribution based on local property values and income of residents. They calculate the revenue growth factor, of which then is given to the department, and they calculate the sheets on what your minimum local contribution should be. And the goal is that no community would pay more than 82.5%. Now, districts that are below are being pushed up to the amount that they can afford. Districts that are way up, above the 82 are being back down to 82.5. I would point out that 82.5 is just an arbitrary number that was chosen when back in '93 when they established this, that a district, and no matter how rich they are, should get some state aid money. So the 82.5, you look back, there's no history. I was around in '93 when this all happened. And this is what a minimum local contribution sheet would look like that you would want to print out for your town. And you take a look at it. On the right-hand side is the calculations coming up with what the equalized valuation, the income, and your target share. The left side, the right side then does the increase, your minimum, the revenue growth factor. And then if you're above or below, depending what they want to do to get you into so that you hit your target share. Then also in this sheet that take a look at is, this is Narragansett where I was, and you take a look at the distribution that goes Templeton money, Narragansett, and Massachusetts vocational money tech gets money. It's divided out based on the foundation budget. So again, you got to take a look at how much each one's going to come. So then Chapter 70 is how is Chapter 70 calculated? It defines defines and calculates the foundation budget in adequate level. It then determines the local contribution, how much the foundation budget should be paid by each city and town, property tax based on the wealth, and the remainder is funded by Chapter 70. So basically, you take your foundation budget minus the minimum local contributions, and for a region, it's all, if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 towns, it's the total minimum local contributions minus your chapter from your foundation budget, and that's your Chapter 70. That's the minimum amount. Remember, foundation is a foundation. It's a minimum amount required that has to be spent. I can tell you back in '93, then '90, when they were going through this, it was a very hard to calculate. And before that, if you try to figure out why you got Chapter 70, there wasn't a calculation really there. Now there is a calculation, whether you agree or disagree, but at least it's a calculation. So what happens now is, as I said, foundation budget minus minimum local contribution equals your Chapter 70. So those are calculations you have to do in order to get to your assessment. So this would be, that you take a look, and it's in the summary. Again, I know I apologize for anything, but trying to show on the left-hand side, it gives you foundation budget minus the required minimum local contributions, and then gives you what your state aid would be. Now, many districts are receiving more Chapter 70 than what the foundation aid would require. It's called held harmless. And that's an important factor that's happening in the state. But again, it calculates, and if you're a hold harmless that you're getting more money than the foundation aid requires, then you get what we call minimum aid, $20, $30 amount per student. So now, the other thing to remember is net school spending, and that is the required local contribution. Chapter 70 equals your net school spending. It doesn't include transportation, debt, or capital, but that's the required minimum you have to spend. And as years go by, if you're spending more, then your net school spending will go up based on what your spending has been in prior years. On the budget, the school committee determines what they need for the students. The budget must be at least net school spending. So now we get into the statutory method. And the way the statutory method is defined is you take your budget, the foundation budget, minus your Chapter 70 for the district, minus your total minimum local contribution of member towns, and minus any local aid in total that you're going to, sometimes you have tuition, you could have E&D, and then finally, that'll calculate the amount above the minimum local contribution. That is, most people, very few districts can operate at a foundation budget. So how much more above do you need in order to meet your budget? The method for sending an amount above the town needs to be stated in the regional agreement. A lot of agreements go by, use the percent of students, but you can calculate any what you want, but it has to be a calculation in the regional agreement. So people can understand the statutory method, when you're saying it only means that you're taking foundation budget, minus Chapter 70, minus minimum local contribution, and then you come up the about. Now, when I say foundation budget, that's the calculation for you get the chapter 70, but you take your budget minus your chapter 70, minus local contribution, how much do you need in order to function? And then transportation, debt, and capital are not part of the statutory method. You can calculate any way you want, how you want to do that. Most of the time, transportation, how many riders, debt and capital, maybe per pupil, however, what you have to calculate, and that has to be in your regional agreement. So what's the total that comes to for when you're going to assess a district, is the required minimum local contribution, the amount over net school spending in your district budget, plus your capital debt, and transportation equals the assessment to the towns. All those things together. Again, is you have to define in your agreement how that's going to happen. And this would be a statutory method, which unfortunately you can't see, but I can give it to you. And what I wanted to show you, go through, unfortunately, try to do stuff on a PowerPoint, but it's calculated, if we took a look at the, here, calculated the budget, minus your chapter 70, minus your minimal local contributions, other rate, and an amount. And then that amount was these two towns was by the percent of students. And then the calculation for transportation, minus your chapter 71 reimbursement, and then per pupil, debt and capital, and this system was doing that way. So that would be qualified for a statutory method. Now, an alternate method that can be done is, by the way, in this one, it requires a 2/3 vote. So for your member towns, if you're 2-town, it requires both. If you're 3, it requires 2. If you're 4, it requires 3. If you're 5, it requires 4. To vote that, notification department is not required. So again, that would be 2/3. If you go an alternate method, the district can choose an alternate method, but it must be stated and defined in the agreement. And remember, they still must meet the minimum local contributions. And this is an alternate method that I did, and I have copies I can give people here if you'd like. But basically, this one was divided. We took the budget minus the chapter 70, and then everything else was by per pupil. I can tell you that regional agreements before 93, everything was per pupil. After 93, took into account the wealth of a community, meaning the value of the property and the income that was of the residents of that community. And again, oh yeah, it has been challenged in court, and what happened? Challenge lost. That's what he just said. So it's been challenged, it's been lost. So all members of the regional school district, and when you do an alternate method, unanimously approve the method. A vote is taken each year to utilize that method. Now, it could be a combined vote saying we're going to use the alternate method and our assessment is this. And the adoption must report to the commissioner. And in question, Rick, you had asked me this morning, how's it reported? It's reported on your end of year report whether you're using a statutory or an alternate method, so I'm sure they're doing it correctly. And then a section to determine after deducting state aid. So again, this is where an alternate assessment comes in. I don't mind, this is one of the things after a statement that I show very quickly, I couldn't show you. In the statutory method for Town A, and remember they swallowing that, Town A would pay in a fictitious town, but with $8,280,000, in Town B, $4,520,000. An alternate method, you can see that it did change because we went the other per pupil. So an alternate method is changing, and usually what it amounts to is that you're shifting costs from one town to another town. And there can be reasons why towns might want to do it, but that's what an alternate method would do. So, and again, what is your agreement, statute, or alternate? If your agreement says like a foundation budget or a budget minus the chapter 70, minus total minimum contributions, and any other local, and then the amount above local contribution hours defined, that's a statutory method. And if you have another one that said, here's your amount, and by percentages that you were doing it, then you have an alternate method, so you can take a look. I'm getting the hook in a minute, so, and I'm done. So again, one of the things is to understand that we work with regions now updating their regional agreements, and when we do that, the department is requiring that you define which method you're using and actually spell it out so that you know. And we say on the regional agreements, when we're doing now, the people working on it now won't be here in 20 or 30 years, so everybody clearly understand how is the assessment done in the process that you have to use. You also have to define, the last thing is when you're doing per pupil, anything with per pupil, you've got to define what are you talking about. Are you talking about foundation enrollment? Are you talking pupils that are in the buildings or whatever? So you have to really define those carefully. Thank you. wanted to say, this is the sample that I put together that you can see when you do the assessment, you come down to the bottom line, is the total assessment, 8,245,000, if you take a look right here. And then when you go an alternate, when you go an alternate method, and I divided the amount above on a per pupil basis, you can see that the shift does happen. So the shift can happen when you do a different calculation. I have those sheets if people want. I give you some sheets afterwards. I have some copies. Yes, ma'am.
But you don't have an option about doing this. I mean, the regional agreement spells out how your assessments are to be done. It's not like you can say, oh, I think this year we're gonna do an alternate method and
No,
we're
you're
gonna
correct.
send a report to you.
No.
So you make the choice when you pass your regional agreement and it's done, right?
Right. It has to be defined in your agreement. You can define a statutory, and you can define an alternate. And the school committee could choose, but they've got to be defined in the agreement, you're correct. Most agreements really are on one or the other. No.
Yeah, so the customer can have any color they want as long as it's black or blue, right? I mean, yeah. Okay, I get to talk about stabilization fund. And I will, I can walk it through them at the same time, hopefully. I'm gonna be talking about capital stabilization, the special ed. I'm not sure if that's really a stabilization, but it's money that can be set aside, as well as the transportation account that districts can set up for savings to spend for transportation costs. So under capital stabilization, obviously it's authorized by Chapter 71, Section 16. You know, I'm not gonna read all this to you, just the highlights that obviously there's gotta be a vote from each of your member towns to establish the fund, and that only has to happen once. In order to fund it, once it's established, the school committee can include a line item to add money to the stabilization fund in their budget, for the annual budget. And it doesn't require a separate vote, it's just, you can just be part of the school committee budget. So it's pretty straightforward. Again, I think the hardest thing in some of these issues is getting all the member communities to vote on it. But once that's done, it's just a matter of putting an amount in the budget to put into the stabilization fund. Oops, too quick. What can you use it for? Well, obviously, you can use it for things in which the regional school district is permitted to borrow, but it does require a 2/3 vote of the school committee in order to use the funds. Now, if you want to use it for any other purposes, it would require the approval of the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education. I don't recall in my lifetime, my work life, again, there may have been issues with this has happened in the past, but I just don't recall any in the last 10 or so years anyway. Expenditures and balances, they're made direct, you can make expenditures directly from the stabilization fund, obviously if you have those votes, 2/3 vote. You don't have to transfer the funds into the general fund. And anything that's left over at the end of the project just basically closes out to the stabilization fund and carries forward. And again, these funds do not impact the calculation of your E&D. So if you're lucky enough to have 5% E&D, you can also carry forward amounts in the stabilization fund as well. And that's true of all of these different funds that I'm going to be speaking of here as well. Now, some of these others may have caps in terms of what's allowed, or there are caps here in terms of that it may not exceed 5% of the amount assessed, number one, and at no time maybe aggregate fund balance exceeds 5% of the combined equalized valuations. I don't know if I've ever seen that. So, I mean, that's pretty high, needless to say. And obviously the regional school district treasurer is the custodian of those funds, and if those funds are in interest, the interest goes right back into the stabilization account. Next is the special education fund. That was done a couple of years ago by an act of the legislature, that was the Municipal Modernization Act, and it allows both municipal and regional school districts to establish a reserve fund for special education costs, for out-of-district tuition and special transportation. Now, in order to establish the fund, it requires a majority vote of the school committee and local legislative body. Now, the local legislative body has been determined to be town meeting. So it'd have to be a majority of the town meetings of your member districts. I'm not sure there's any regional school districts who would avail themselves of this, and I'll get to that in a minute. But again, once it's established, just like the other stabilization fund, school committee can include in their budget an amount to be transferred into that account. For regional school district, the amount to be appropriated in the fund is included in each member town's assessment, obviously. Again, balances and expenditures. The balance in the fund cannot exceed 2% of the district's annual net spending. Now, that's not required net school spending, it's actual net school spending. Believe it or not, that has come up, and it makes a difference based on what community you're from, needless to say. Now, funds can only be expended for this after a majority vote from both the school committee and the select. What that means for a regional school district is that you'd have to get a majority vote of the school committee plus a majority vote of all the selectmen and of all of your members. You think establishing a capital stabilization fund is tough? Holy mackerel, why would you even want to do that? Again, I think this is a glitch in the legislation. That's something that if that legislation ever gets tweaked, it's something that we would suggest that you wouldn't have to go back to 6-member towns to get 6 selectmen to pay a tuition bill for a special education student. But again, if it's required right now as part of the law. Question?
So I was gonna clarify, so when you say majority vote of the board, so if you have a 3-town district, you need a majority?
2/3, you'd have to get 2/3 of them the selectmen to vote yes.
So you only need 2 out of the 3 boards to vote yes?
That's correct.
Okay, so it's,
Not 2/3 of all the people.
so not a majority of each of the 3 districts?
Well, again, you need a majority of the number
Right.
of the members, right, exactly, to approve it.
Okay.
Which is a pretty high bar for an operating expense like this, to be honest. And I think that was something that probably, like, as I said, if this legislation is tweaked at all, this is the area where we believe it would be tweaked in the future.
Unimog 2 is coming up.
Okay, stay tuned. And we'll do a better job of involving everybody in terms of letting them know when this does occur. We didn't do a very good job the first time around in terms of informing people groups like MASC about that. That's one of those fool me once kind of situations that will not happen the second time around, because we got a lot of great suggestions at the MASC meeting where Sean Cronin presented this about the muni, the new law. So we will take that into consideration next time around. Question in the back.
If you have 2-member towns, I'm assuming you have to get approval from both of them?
That's correct. 100% would be required in 2-member towns, right?
The vote to correct or to establish the capital stabilization,
Mm-hmm.
when did that come in? Do you know?
That's been in the law for quite some time, a long time ago.
And,
Yeah.
I'm not sure we ever did that, to be quite frank. I mean, we were the first K-12 district, and I haven't been around for all that time, but you know.
There are some things I may not want to hear.
I'm just saying that in spite of all the different, I've been through like, I guess, 5 regional agreement changes, and still don't
Wow.
remember us ever doing that. All it means is that I don't remember that.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I don't recall that either, Senator. Okay, all right, thank you very much, I appreciate that. So, again, for this reason, I'm not sure that many regional school districts will avail themselves of this special education fund. Here is one, obviously, the regional school districts have availed themselves of it. It was established a couple of years ago for regional transportation. It kind of makes transportation funds kind of like circuit breaker, in that the fund is there, you can vote to put part of your reimbursement into the stabilization fund, and that stabilization fund carries forward for 1 year, And if you don't use those funds at the close of the next fiscal year, then it just closes out to your E&D. So you basically have 1 year to do it. Now, and the reason this was established was a lot of districts said, look, when we're building our budgets, we have no idea how much regional transportation aid we're gonna be getting. We know what we got last year, and it's in most cases, you have a better clue as to what you'll be receiving when you're building your budget for the following year. Granted, the final calculations usually don't come out until the spring, but we usually give you estimates, like when the budget gets passed, we give you estimates and we post it on our website. And again, I usually will, any district can call at any point in time during the year and ask if that has been updated. Again, some of that is based on whether we've received all the district's end of year reports, because that's the data that we use to calculate the transportation reimbursements. So unless we have that, it's gonna be hard to say whether we've calculated it yet. But generally, I send out a first payment at either the end of December or the beginning of January for transportation. So those calculations are usually done sometime in December, so that I can come up with what I think is gonna be approximately half of that payment that's gonna be coming out as the first payment, as long as you filed your end of the year report on time. But again, that's when those calculations are generally done. So you'll have that information. So again, if you have that information, you can at least know what you think you're gonna be getting in terms of building your next year's budget, which was, again, the theory behind this. So again, you can only use the funds for transportation expenses. I'm great at a veil threat, as a matter of fact, and I have good hearing as well. Expenses charged to the fund are considered local expenditures for reporting purposes. So for instance, if you have one of these funds and you expend the funds during the year for say your school bus contract, then you would report that just like an additional school committee appropriation in the school committee appropriation section of the end of the year report. Question, yeah.
Just want to add one thing on using that fund. When transportation money comes in, bring it into your general fund, then make the decision what you're going to spend it over the transportation fund. Because if you dump it into the transportation fund, you can't bring it back in to your general fund.
And I wanted to follow the lead of all my other presenters by putting something up here that's completely unreadable. But this is an interesting slide, because basically this is where regional transportation has been since 1980. And obviously, there was only like 5 or 6 years that it was even close to 100%. And for anybody who's heard me talk, I know you were all promised. I get it. I understand. But one of the things I've learned in my many years as a state official is 100% reimbursement of anything is really bad public policy. And people end up making really dumb decisions because they don't care, because it's not their money. What do you care? It's the state's money. Whatever.
Yeah, but why does the statute read?
Subject to
The statute reads subject to appropriation.
And what's the definition of appropriation? To appropriate means to fund.
Yeah.
Okay, it doesn't mean to decide how much to fund, it means to fund.
Well, but again, we as a department, we don't fund. So your beef is with the legislature, not with us.
I understand that, but when we're talking about you want us to have skin in the game, the actual way the statute reads is fully fund.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I understand. I think you'll get the hook on me in a heartbeat if we continue this conversation. Again, I'll just let it move on from there, but thank you very much for your attention. Oh, question, over there, sorry.
Question. When we've talked about these types of funds in our district, there's kind of a feeling among our member towns that they'd rather hold on to the money rather than having us hold on to the money. I know. Do you know approximately how many of each of those funds are established in districts today, and how many of them are actually being used?
We don't collect that information, to be quite honest with you. That's not something that we ask on the end of the year report. Because as I said, we tell districts that in the event they do have those accounts and they expend from those accounts, to consider it like an additional school committee appropriation. So we would have no way of knowing specifically how much of what they spent was from one of those accounts. I guess you should survey your members. I would try to survey your members of, and the regional school committee folks are pretty good about answering that. We've dealt with Ellen Holmes quite a bit, and done some work with the regional committee for quite a few years. Usually when the governor's budget comes out, we usually have a conference call to talk about what that means and things like that. So again, we're certainly willing to help if there's something we can do in that respect. But I just don't know, I'm not sure that's something that we would want to add to our end of the year report reporting.
No.
So
Yeah.
I honestly don't know off the top of my head, because, and even if I did, it would just be anecdotal.
Okay.
I'm Mary Jane Handy, and the reason I'm here is the Division of Local Services is the division of the Department of Revenue that certifies the E&D. Just in case a lot of people might not know who we are. So I went through, and this is the statute. This is the CMR for E&D. It says a regional committee may use all or part of the certified balance in E&D as a revenue source for its proposed budget. If the balance exceeds 5% of the proposed budget, the regional school committee shall use the amount in excess as a percentage of the revenue source in the proposed budget. All right? So what we have is the big problem that we're having right now is the word proposed budget. E&D, Jesse and I, Jay and I have spent a long time discussing this. We interpret that the proposed budget is defined as the budget as adopted by the school committee to be submitted to the local appropriating authority. Meaning, if your E&D is not certified, you have no authority to do the budget. All right? Let me tell you what happened this past year. June 28th, we had a regional school committee submit their E&D to us. They had put in their budget for the following year $1.2 million. What happens if I couldn't certify it that day? How in the world are they going to come up with $1.2 million?
Well, let's be clear. It wasn't because we just got around to trust me, I don't think people in trouble here.
No.
It wasn't because the E&D sat at DOR till June 28th. That's when it was submitted. We chased that district all spring from March on to try to get that information in. So again, I just want to be clear in terms of context.
Yeah. Yes.
How would you even go anywhere with that? I mean, I thought E&D was, I thought the submissions were due like end of.
You're right, they are. They're due by statute.
Due by end of October.
October 31. I had there's 83 regional school districts, if my numbers are correct, if my memory serves me right. And Barbara just said I am, so I feel good today. 21 of them did not have their E&D certified by April 1st. We certified 21 out of 83 in April, May, and June. This is not going to happen again. We have now determined, we have clarified, proposed budget means if it is not certified, just like free cash for a city and town. If free cash is not certified, that city and town does not have authority to even appropriate it. They can't put it in town meeting vote. They can't use it for a city council vote. We're doing the same thing with E&D. We're tightening it up. So what we're saying, if E&D is not certified prior to the vote, the district does not have the authority to use E&D as a source. If you use it after the vote, the district will have to follow the procedures to amend your budget. Put it this way, you've gone through one budget process and got it passed. Do you really want to go through a second one? I was business manager for 15 years, regional business manager. You don't want to go through budget process twice. There's no way. So again, so on those 21 regional school districts, those superintendents will be getting a personal call from me. I will remind them gently that it needs to be certified prior to putting it in the budget that is approved by their school committee that they send to their towns. So some communities, some regional schools adopt their budget in April, some do it earlier. The reason we're bringing this up to you people is I could tell the business managers and then I get the sob stories. Okay?
So, kind of gentle.
Yes, I'm kind and gentle. You have to realize we have I have a department of 12 people certifying 83 E&Ds and 351 free cash calculations. That's it. So we have, again, proposed budget means before you submit it to your towns, it has to be approved. So what you need to do, if any superintendent's in the room, make sure your school business manager will be putting this out in writing. Make sure they get it to us prior. Do you have another question?
No, just a comment. You need more people.
Yeah, good luck with that. That's like adding staff to your administrative office at the school district level. Good luck with that too, you know what I'm saying? I totally understand. We're all in the same boat.
Yeah. Well, we went through ERIP, the early retirement incentive, 3 years ago. This is what we got. So.
Mary Jane, you mentioned about sending the kind letter to the regional superintendent. How about also copying the regional school committee chair? Because we're the ones who'll be doing that voting in the end of the day.
Thank you.
You get back up on us, plus we supervise the superintendents.
Thank you for the suggestion. Anybody else?
Can you repeat a question, please?
Oh, she asked if I could also send the letter when we send it to the superintendent and the business manager to include the chair of the school committee. Yeah.
Is there any sanction on a community for not getting its free cash certified?
Meaning if they don't?
Can't spend it, that's all.
You can't spend it.
No, you can't spend it, but one of the towns in our district didn't certify their free cash for 2 years. They slashed their K budget on the basis they couldn't afford it, and then when they finally certified their free cash, they had $1.2 million in free cash. So, isn't there anything that the Department of Revenue can do to require towns to get this free? I mean, it's supposed to have it certified within a certain.
There's no requirement to submit for free cash certification in Massachusetts. There is for E&D, and the reason for E&D is you can't have more than the 5%. That's why. However, there are times that some districts, some towns or cities cannot submit their E&D calculation to us. It's because that their financial records are in such disarray. I mean, we've had a community that had to reconstruct their financial records for 3 years at a tune of $100,000 to get their records back on track. I mean, we've seen that. You can have a town accountant who leaves, wasn't very good to begin with, and then all of a sudden you go through and you have to recreate records. So we can't certify a number if the records are in disarray, because we don't have any validity on those numbers.
Right. My point is, there's no penalty on the community for not having appropriate records or having capable people working in their treasurer's office.
So unfortunately, there's no statute for that. One thing I do want to make sure that I do mention, that starting this year, we have standardized the submissions for E&D certifications for our office. We did the same things with the free cash certification. There are district balance sheets. And I just want to let you know that on this, you can read it and you'll go through. The E&D notification letters go through to the people that are in our gateway system and our local official directory. This is the DOR directory. There are times that the superintendent's name and email address has not been updated, or the business manager. That's why people do not get the letters. We also send the notification letters to the towns that belong to that district. So if you're over your 5% for a regional school district, your towns know about it. We sent this bulletin. It was issued that explains the requirements for the E&D and for the balance sheet. And that's it that I have.
So I'm supposed to speak on OPEB, but I haven't completed my E&D certification, so I'm actually going to leave now. But I did do my end-of-year report. Thanks, Jay.
What's the transportation money?
Yeah, I do. I do.
He comes first, unfortunately.
I do love Jared, though. Jared's great. So OPEB, what is OPEB? OPEB is stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. So typically that is the future cost of health insurance. That relates to the premiums of your health insurance, but can also include pharmaceuticals, dental, vision, long-term disability, and long-term care benefits. So this is the future liability of your retirees. Basically, if you were to cease operations today, what would it cost to fulfill the benefits that you've promised to your employees going into the future? So again, this is a future liability. It is not a pension liability, which is GASB 6768. This is different. This is just on your health care for your retirees. So the reporting requirements have changed over the past few years. We used to do what was called GASB 4345. GASB stands for the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. So these are required actuarial reports that have to be produced on a yearly basis to calculate that future liability. Last year, FY17, we did a net OPEB liability, so it introduced some of that liability onto your balance sheet. But unfortunately, in 18, it's going to show the full liability of this future liability on our books. Now, it doesn't seem that important probably at first glance, but what you have to realize is this is going to cause a substantial change in your balance sheet, in your district's books. What that means is, if I have $3 million in assets, well, once I introduce that $20 million liability, I'm very much in the red. So what does that mean? Who cares? Who reads these reports? Your credit rating bureaus do. This became very important for my district. We just went out to, I'm getting $85 million next week for a building project, and establishing an OPEB fund, funding an OPEB fund was very impactful to my credit rating in being able to get a good interest rate for that bond. So the idea is, do you pay as you go or do you pre-fund? Most districts had that theory that they would just pay as you go. You put a line item in your budget, in my case it's about $700,000 every year to fund the retiree health insurance benefits, and that's what we do. But that's not good enough anymore because we are not able to sustain the ever-growing cost, the ever-growing liability on our books. So what we do, what is being suggested now is a pre-funding arrangement where your district establishes a funding agreement of what you will attempt to fund each year in your OPEB fund and make habit of that each year. So contributions to this fund is considered an asset, which is great because it offsets your liability. Investing your assets, investing that money is very, very important. There are many ways that you can sustain a OPEB fund. You can do it independently, and most districts think that they have an appropriate OPEB fund, but I think when they get their FY18 audit done, they're going to realize maybe that they didn't reach all those statutory requirements. But you can also go into group pooling arrangements, which is very advantageous to a small district like mine, where my contributions of $100,000, $150,000 each year are being pooled with $20 million of other arrangement, and we're all reaching that higher rate of return on our invested OPEB funds. So again, like I said, credit agencies look more favorably if you have an established OPEB fund and you are contributing to it. So how do you contribute to your OPEB fund? You have to contribute to it, you have to establish a line item in your budget. And that's how your OPEB is funded each year, is through the budget. District to district, it really varies greatly. And I think it has a lot to do with the philosophy of your school committee, the philosophy of your administration, your superintendent, your business manager. But it's important to at least establish this fund and then work towards funding it. Some statistics I read was about, on average, 10%, their districts about 10% funded, but it varies from no funding to 60% funded. In my district, even though it's a commitment, we're only funded at 3%. So we do have a long way to go as well.
Just a question, you know, this is the same thing that the towns are going through.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
And what I'm curious about is, did anybody ever raise the question of why shouldn't that be on their books, not our books?
Because we are our own entity. We are
Our
a,
own entity, but basically our entity was put in place to provide education to the children of our districts.
sure, but if you're a 12-town region,
Which is a function really and responsibility of the towns by the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Mass.
However,
They have chosen to fund it through us.
you're a legal entity. Your regional school district is a legal
I agree
entity,
with
and
that.
that's why, because it's a legal entity.
So no one's taking this to court.
It's
Yeah.
got to do with how.
Who is the employer, sir?
It sounds like you want it both ways. You want to be a regional school district for something, but then you don't want to have the responsibility that goes with it on the other side, you
I
know?
don't care, I'm a taxpayer of the Commonwealth of Mass, and I'm saying as provided by the Constitution of Mass, I'm responsible for the education of children within my town. My town, like many others, have chosen to outsource that work to someone else. That doesn't say that I gave up legally the responsibility, including this cost. I'm just surprised no one's ever taken us to court on that.
If the regional school collapsed, the OPEB would go to the town.
Yeah.
Yes, it would.
Somehow it would.
It would go
Somehow
to
it
For
would.
the same rationale that I just stated, right, absolutely.
It would go to the town.
I'm just
I have no
surprised that
idea.
no one's ever.
I have no idea how that would work out.
Because we
And I hope I never find out. Because I don't want a city and town to collapse in the United States.
Can always ask the attorney
Well,
general.
neither do I, but I'm just
Yeah.
surprised that some lawyer hasn't said I can make a lot of money taking this to court.
Yes, go ahead.
Because it was quite frank.
Quick clarifying question, you said, pre-funding agreement for OPEB, that would be an agreement between you and who?
a funding policy. So the policy would be your school committee establishing a policy, and in fact, that's the third bullet on here. What does that policy look like? And I think that varies greatly, and it really varies upon your affordability. I mean, let's get real. Do I really want to put $500,000 in my budget to fund post-retirement benefits when I need 2 more classroom teachers and I have to put money into my failing infrastructure? No, but it's something that we have to do, and especially when you're borrowing money, you need to keep your balance sheet in a favorable position. And establishing that policy, it looks different everywhere. You can say it's a fixed annual contribution. We dedicate to spend $200,000 each year in OPEB. You can say it's a percentage of your payroll. 1% of your payroll each year we will put into OPEB. That's a lofty thing to try to do. Another thing that I've seen a lot of districts do is say, okay, well, here's my flat contribution, but anything left over in my dental or my health insurance lines, I'm gonna have the school committee revote a line item transfer, and I'm gonna transfer that into OPEB. My district uses probably a combination of the first. We have a dedicated contribution this year, $100,000, but last year we were able to put extra $100,000. Another way to put money in this is through your Medicare retiree Part D subsidies that come through. That does not have to go through your budget. The statutory says that we can just take those retiree subsidies and put it right back into the OPEB trust fund.
But do you think that OPEB will go in that, in order to do your financials every year, you're gonna have to post, you know, what your true liability is based on some kind of actuarial study?
Absolutely.
So again, it's kind of like pensions. Now, you folks only have to deal with the pensions of, say, the school lunch people or the secretaries or the paraprofessionals. because obviously the state's taking care of the pension obligations of anybody who's certified. But again, it's kind of the same thing. You have to pay an assessment for your pension costs, and you have to say what that will cost you in the coming years. So they have what's called an ARC, and whether you're funding the ARC, which is the annual something or other contribution, I believe it's called. I think OPEB is probably going to be going the same way. It's just trying to be rational about what your district may owe in the future in terms of future obligations.
Yes, so pensions have to be funded. Pensions are also on your liability on your books.
We set up a stabilization fund and then reached the goal that we had hoped to get to maintain, and then took the money that we were putting in that and shifted it to OPEB.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I agree. I would say the last most important thing to talk to is how to control these costs. When you're going into negotiations, it's important to at least have this in the back of your mind, because what you're negotiating for now equals dollars in the future. So looking at, and I'm trying to do this with my superintendent, looking at some creative ways to try to shift some of that burden. And he tries to remind me all the time that we're both going to be retirees someday. But I understand that right now our budget is so crunched by these numbers, we have to do something about it. So ways to look at this is structuring your benefit packages going forward, tiering them on years of service to your district, changing the requirements for age and service, perhaps not covering your spouse or your family at the same cost share as your employee, looking at adjusting retiree contributions going forward into the future, but then also looking at cost containing within your plans. Can you shift to more high deductible cost plans, which eventually lowers the liability into the future? Do you look at an EGWIP plan where it changes some of the cost share to Medicare? Looking to make some of these plans more affordable now as well as in the future, because the liability is there and it continues to grow.
On a totally unrelated note, I would like to make a plug for something that we're doing. I don't know if school committee folks are aware of the fact that the Every Student Succeeds Act requires the department to publish per pupil expenditures on a school-by-school basis. And we will be doing the first iteration of those report cards this December. Now, I know it may sound innocuous, but in the event, we went to school-by-school reporting back in fiscal 2002. And I remember the knockdown, drag-out fights we had with school business officials who didn't want to provide that information. In the event that they were going to, they said, are you going to ever publish this information? And all I could say was, trust me, as much as we're here to help, there's only so much I can guarantee. I said, we have no plans to publish any of this data, but the reason we started collecting it was we had an accountability system that was on a school-by-school basis. We wanted to have school-by-school data. So it wasn't our plan to publish it. The Every Student Succeeds Act, the new Title I, is forcing us to publish it. So again, if you have a special ed program in one of your elementary schools that isn't in one of your other schools, it could make it look like you're spending more money in that school per student than you're spending in other schools. You should be prepared to be able to kind of talk about that and see that. We're doing a webinar on December 4th for school committee folks. It's going to be in the evening. It's going to be at 6 o'clock. So we're going to be sending it out. We're going to give it to Margaret Driscoll, and she'll send it out to the school committee folks. We've got one established for during the daytime at the end of November, the week after Thanksgiving for school folks that we'll do at noon, and one the following week we'll do at 6 o'clock. Again, we can get 150 people each in each one of these webinars. If there's more demand, we will schedule additional webinars. Rob?
Yeah, it's 125.
Oh.
Yeah.
So we've just been cut by 25 people.
If there's high demand, we'll add sessions.
Well, there you go. Well, again, if you guys all get together in one room and call in, that's even better. Anyway, but again, it's just something that we want districts to be aware of, both superintendents, school business officials, and school committee folks, because this is data that's gonna be out there, that if somebody just downloads off the end of the year, or off of our website, off of the report cards, and then you get confronted at a school committee meeting, you should be prepared to be able to deal with that. So again, forewarned is forearmed. I think it's just a matter of us trying to help you understand what's gonna be on those report cards and a way of kind of letting you form processes to deal with that in the future. Yes, Bob?
At the end of the year, surplus revenue goes to ED, correct?
Correct.
But the transportation fund, you're saying that surplus revenue in the transportation line items in the revenue side can be put into transportation.
That's correct. They go in that fund and it can stay there for 1 year.
And then it can go.
And then it should be, that should be the first money that you spend next year.
As a revenue source.
And then, if you wanna put in money that's in next year's budget in there, you can do that, but again, that lets it lop over for 1 year.
Thank you.
Also, if I could, superintendents and school committee members, you do not have the authority to overspend your budget. Okay?
Do we have to say that?
Yes, we have to say that. I'm sorry, but we do. Just because you have extra money that comes in, more chapter 70 or whatever it is, does not mean you have authority to spend it unless you amend your budget and go through the process to amend your budget. We've had more school committees that go through and overspend their expenditure budget because they got an extra $50,000 in transportation. This happens all the time. I hate to say it, but you know, there's 83 of you and everybody tries to do something a little different or goes through and doesn't understand. Again, you cannot overspend your budget. You do not have authority.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say, Steve Evans, as you know, I was executive director for a number of years, then went to an interim job and then came back as assistant. I'm going to be leaving as the assistant executive director in December. Maureen Marsh will be coming in as the assistant, but I'll still continue doing consulting work. We have a Mars consulting group within Mars that we're going to be doing, so I'll continue with that. I'm getting a little old, so I'd like to calm down a little bit with some stuff and doing that. So, but I want to say thank you for coming today and appreciate the people coming. And I can remember starting that with the MASC that we wanted to do some for regional schools, and I want to thank them for allowing us to have these programs so that you can come and have discussions on regional schools. Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming today. We are delighted that you are all here and asking great questions. As Barbara mentioned, the presentations will be up on the 3 different websites. These folks are available. If you have questions for them, I'm sure they'll be around at some point. Please look for them, ask your questions, and thank you all for all